The night Serena Voss signed her name on a contract she never thought she'd read, her hands weren't shaking from cold. It was July in Vancouver, warm enough that the windows of the hotel conference room had fogged slightly from the air conditioning meeting the summer heat outside. Her hands were shaking because she understood, with complete clarity, exactly what she was agreeing to. Across the table sat Julian Mercer. He didn't look like someone who needed anything from anyone. That was the first thing she'd noticed about him when he walked into the room 40 minutes earlier. Not his suit, not the way his assistant hovered 2 steps behind him, like a shadow trained to be useful, but the particular quality of his stillness. Julian Mercer, 41 years old, founder of Mercer Capital Group and one of the wealthiest private investors in the country, sat with the ease of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no and believed it. He slid the contract across the table without ceremony. "Page 3 outlines the compensation," he said. "Page 7 covers the surrogacy terms. Page 12 is the non-disclosure agreement. If you have questions, my legal team is available." He checked his watch, a small, precise movement. "I'd like this resolved tonight." Serena didn't look at page 3. She already knew the number, $500,000. Enough to cover her daughter Lily's next 4 years of specialized care. The medical equipment the provincial coverage didn't reach, and the lease on the small apartment in Burnaby where Lily lived with Serena's mother while Serena worked double shifts at the hospital. Enough to stop the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from working hard, but from working hard and still watching someone you love go without. She turned to page 7. The language was cold in the way that legal language always was, but the meaning was simple. She would carry Julian Mercer's child through IVF, live in his home in West Vancouver during the pregnancy for health monitoring purposes, and upon the child's birth relinquish all parental claim. She would then receive the second half of her payment and be free to leave. Free. That was the word they used. "I need to know something first," Serena said. Julian glanced up from his phone. It was, she realized, the first time he had actually looked at her since sitting down. "Why this way?" she asked. "You have resources most people can't imagine. Why not adoption? Why not?" She paused, choosing the word carefully. A relationship. Something moved across his face. It wasn't annoyance exactly. It was more like the expression of a man who had been asked a question he considered already answered. "Because I want certainty," he said. "Relationships introduce variables I'm not interested in managing. This is a business arrangement. It suits both of us." Serena looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen. She thought about Lily, 5 years old, laughing at something on the television that morning when Serena had called to say goodnight, her small voice entirely unconcerned with the conversation her mother was about to have 3 hours away in a downtown hotel room. She thought about how Lily's laugh sounded like something worth protecting at almost any cost. She signed. The house in West Vancouver was not what Serena had expected, and she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. Something cold, probably. Something that matched the man. Instead, the property sat at the edge of a forested ridge with a view of the inlet that on clear days showed the mountains in the distance like a postcard someone had propped against the sky. The interior was spare but not cruel. High ceilings, warm wood floors, windows that let the light move through in the afternoon. Someone had cared about this space, even if that person no longer seemed to. A woman named Dorothy, who managed the household and had apparently been with Julian for 11 years, showed Serena to her room. It was larger than her apartment in Burnaby. The closet held clothes in her size that she hadn't chosen and didn't want. On the nightstand was a small stack of books. Fiction, mostly, a few of which she'd mentioned to Julian's assistant during a perfunctory needs and preferences call the week before. She hadn't expected him to have actually noted them. "Mr. Mercer asks that you join him for dinner at 7, Dorothy said, with the mild formality of someone who had learned to deliver his requests as though they were suggestions. "He wants to go over the schedule for the coming weeks." Serena set her bag on the bed. "Is he always like this?" Dorothy considered the question with more seriousness than Serena had anticipated. "He's consistent," she said finally. "That's not nothing." Dinner was brief and functional. Julian sat at the head of a table that could have seated 12 and outlined, between precise bites of food he didn't appear to taste, the schedule for medical appointments, the household expectations, and the scope of what he called reasonable interaction. "I don't expect us to socialize," he said. "You'll have full use of the property. Dorothy will accommodate whatever you need. I'm in the office most days and traveling several times a month. This shouldn't be complicated. And if I want to visit my daughter, Serena asked. Julian paused, just slightly. You have a daughter. It was not a question, but it wasn't quite an accusation either. It sat between them in the silence of the dining room. Her name is Lily, Serena said. She's 5. She has a rare metabolic condition that requires ongoing treatment. She lives with my mother. She is the reason I'm here. Julian set down his fork. He looked at her with an attention that was different from how he'd looked at her in the hotel. Less transactional, more something she couldn't name. You should have disclosed that, he said. Your intake questionnaire asked about my medical history and employment. It didn't ask whether I was a mother. A long pause. Outside the window, the inlet caught the last of the evening light. You can visit her, Julian said finally. Once a week, contingent on the medical schedule. I'd ask that you're back by Sunday evening. Serena nodded. It was more than she'd expected. Thank you, she said, and meant it, and hated that she meant it. The first month passed the way months do when you are in an unfamiliar place trying to become invisible. Slowly at the edges, quickly in the middle. Serena settled into rhythms. Morning walks along the ridge path above the house. Where the Douglas firs were so tall, she sometimes stopped just to look up at them. Afternoons reading or doing the online coursework toward her nursing specialization. Evenings alone in the sitting room off her bedroom calling her mother, calling Lily, listening to her daughter's detailed and completely absorbing accounts of things that had happened at kindergarten. Julian was largely absent. When he was home, they passed each other with the careful courtesy of people sharing space under agreed terms. He said good morning. She said good morning back. Occasionally they were in the kitchen at the same time, and the silence had a quality she couldn't characterize. Not hostile, not comfortable, just present. The first IVF transfer was performed in the 3rd week at a clinic in the city. Julian was there for the appointment but remained in a separate waiting area. The procedure was clinical and uncomfortable, and she'd had worse. The doctor, a calm woman named Dr. Ashworth, explained everything twice and answered Serena's questions directly. She liked Dr. Ashworth. She was glad Julian had chosen her. Driving back to West Vancouver afterward, Julian said nothing for a long time. Then, "How are you feeling? Like someone who just had a medical procedure," Serena said. "Right." He kept his eyes on the road. "Dorothy will have something ready for you when we get back. She said you mentioned soup." Serena turned to look at him. "When did I mention soup? You told her last week you'd been craving it." He said it with the affect of someone reporting a logistical fact. She faced forward again and watched the bridge appear out of the gray morning. "That was considerate," she said. He didn't answer, but when they got back, there was soup. It was Dorothy who first began to fill in the outlines of who Julian Mercer actually was. Not through anything direct, she was far too composed for gossip, but through the small accumulation of details that came from 11 years of proximity. She mentioned, one afternoon while Serena was helping her carry things in from the garden, that Julian had grown up partly in Calgary, partly in London, that his parents had separated when he was 12 and both had remarried within 2 years, that he'd built his first business at 24 and lost it at 27, and built a better one by 30, that he had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman named Adrian, and that it had ended the year his mother got sick, and that after his mother died, Julian had become someone who believed, with great conviction, that he could manage loss if he could only manage enough things around it. "He's not cold," Dorothy said, pulling dead leaves from a planter with efficient, affectionate hands. "He's scared." They looked similar from the outside. Serena didn't say anything, but she thought about it for days. The morning the first transfer confirmed, 11 weeks in, cautiously and then less cautiously. Julian stood at the kitchen counter with the clinic's email open on his phone, and he went so still that Serena, who was pouring coffee across the room, stopped and looked at him. She had never seen him look like that. He was not a man who showed things. But for one unguarded moment, something passed through his face that was unmistakably hope. It arrived and departed in the space of a few seconds, and then he was composed again, methodical, reading the rest of the email with appropriate gravity. "The first trimester monitoring schedule begins next week," he said. "I know," Serena said. "I read the same email." He looked up, and then something almost like a smile, asymmetric, cautious, like something he wasn't sure he was allowed, crossed his face and disappeared. She turned back to her coffee before he could see that she was smiling too. The nausea arrived in week 7, with the focused intention of something that had been waiting. Serena, who was used to long shifts and low sleep and the particular stoicism that comes from years of caring for other people, found it genuinely difficult. She didn't complain. She ate crackers at odd hours and ginger tea that Dorothy made from scratch and refused to lie in bed during the day on principle. One evening she was sitting on the back deck in the cool air, which helped when Julian came home from the city and stopped in the doorway. "You look awful," he said. "That's a terrible thing to say to someone." "It's accurate." He went inside and came back with a blanket that he held out to her with the slightly uncertain manner of a man who didn't often offer blankets to people. She took it. He sat in the other chair without being asked. They sat like that for a while, watching the water change color in the last light. "Tell me about Lily," he said eventually. Serena looked at him. He was watching the inlet, not her, which made it easier somehow. "She was born early," Serena said. 32 weeks. She spent the first month of her life in the NICU. And I spent it in the rocking chair next to her incubator reading her picture books out loud because someone told me it helped and I needed something to do with my hands. She paused. The metabolic condition was diagnosed at 18 months. It affects how she processes certain amino acids. She'll manage it her whole life. But she's honestly one of the funniest people I've ever met. She has opinions about everything. She told me last week that the moon was taking up too much sky, and she thought someone should do something about it. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then, "How old is she?" 5. "Does she know where you are?" "I told her I'm working somewhere new for a while. She thinks I'm a hospital nurse who sometimes lives at the hospital." Serena pulled the blanket tighter. She accepted that with significantly more grace than most adults would. Julian looked at his hands. "My mother was in hospital for almost a year before she died," he said. "I was 36. I kept thinking I should be better at it, at watching someone be ill, at knowing what to do." He stopped. "I wasn't. Nobody is," Serena said. "That's not a skill you acquire, it's just something you survive." He looked at her then, really looked the way he rarely did. "Why nursing?" he asked. "Because I'm good at being present when things are hard," she said simply. "And because being useful is the closest thing I have to certainty." He didn't answer. But something in the careful architecture of his expression shifted slightly, like a door opened just an inch. The following Saturday, Serena drove to Burnaby to see Lily. She had been counting the days since the last visit with an attention she usually reserved for medication schedules. When she pulled up to her mother's building and Lily came running down the front path, her dark hair loose, her face wearing an expression of total uncomplicated joy, Serena crouched down and caught her and held her for a long moment with her eyes closed. "You smell different," Lily announced. "I use different soap now. I don't like it." "Noted." Serena pulled back to look at her. "You're taller." "I know. Grandma measured me on the door." Lily took her hand and began pulling her toward the building with great purpose. "I have to show you something important." The something important was a drawing she had made of their family, Serena tall on the left, her mother in the middle, Lily rendered in a somewhat abstract style on the right, all three figures holding hands. There was a gap on the left side of the paper that Lily had filled with a large yellow sun. "Who's the sun?" Serena asked. Lily thought about this. "Nobody yet," she said. Serena drove back to West Vancouver with the drawing folded carefully in her bag. She didn't look at it again that night, but she knew it was there. Things shifted after that. Slightly at first, then less slightly. Julian began to be home more in the evenings. Serena didn't ask why, and he didn't offer an explanation, but she noticed. He started appearing in the kitchen while she was making tea, not doing anything in particular, just present. He asked her questions, about nursing, about Vancouver before she'd moved there, about the books she was reading. He answered her questions in return, concisely at first, and then less concisely, as though the conciseness had been a habit he was slowly forgetting. One evening she found him in the garage, which she'd assumed was simply a place where expensive cars sat, and discovered instead that it contained a half-finished wooden table he was apparently building by hand. "I didn't know you did this," she said. He looked up from the piece he was sanding, slightly embarrassed. "My grandfather was a carpenter. He died when I was 14. I started doing this." He gestured at the table about 4 years ago. "I find it useful." She ran her hand along the wood. "It's beautiful." He said nothing. But he didn't ask her to leave, and she stayed for an hour, sitting on a stack of lumber, talking about nothing in particular, and it was the most relaxed she'd seen him. The crisis came on a Tuesday in the 19th week. Serena was at the clinic for a routine appointment when Dr. Ashworth identified an anomaly on the ultrasound, a small but significant marker that required immediate follow-up. The next 2 days were the worst kind of uncertainty: waiting rooms, second opinions, Serena lying very still in various rooms while doctors spoke to each other over her in careful professional language that she, as a nurse, understood and could not ununderstand. Julian stayed. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to be elsewhere and be updated by his assistant. Instead, he was there, both days, in every waiting room, in the chair beside her when the doctors came in to speak. He didn't say a great deal. He didn't offer reassurances he couldn't guarantee, which she'd experienced enough in her professional life to know was the more honest kindness. He just stayed. On the second evening, when the follow-up confirmed that the marker was a variation within normal range and not an indication of anything serious, Serena sat in the car in the clinic parking garage for a few minutes and let herself cry. The controlled, thorough kind of crying she did privately when she needed to discharge something she'd been holding. Julian waited. When she was finished, he offered her a packet of tissues from the glove compartment with the slightly stiff manner of someone doing something unfamiliar. "Thank you," she said, "for being here. I was always going to be here," he said, which was true, and which was also, she realized, the first thing he'd said in 2 days that was about more than logistics. She wiped her eyes. "Julian, why do you actually want a child? Not the answer you gave me in the hotel, the real one." A long pause. The parking garage was quiet around them. "Because I don't want to be the last of something," he said finally. "My family," he paused, and she heard the thing underneath the word. "My family was loud once, when I was very young, before everything contracted. I don't want what's left of it to just stop." He looked at the dashboard. "I know that's not a particularly rational reason." "It's the most human thing you've ever said to me," Serena told him. He looked at her, then away. "Drive me home," she said. "I need soup again." Something that might have been a laugh moved across his face. He started the car. She called her mother that night and mentioned, carefully, that things at the placement were going better than she'd expected. Her mother, who had the particular diagnostic acuity of a woman who had known Serena for 32 years, said, "How much better?" in a tone that Serena chose not to fully engage with. In the 24th week, Julian asked if he could come on the next visit to see Lily. Serena was at the kitchen table with her coursework. She looked up. "You don't have to," she said carefully. "I know." He was standing at the counter, arms crossed, looking at the middle distance in the way he did when he was working through something. "She's part of your life, and he stopped. "I'd like to know your life." Serena closed her laptop. "She's going to ask you direct questions," she said. "She asks everyone direct questions. She once asked a bus driver what his greatest regret was. What did he say? He said he'd never learned to swim. She told him it wasn't too late." Serena paused. She was 4. Julian looked at her steadily. "I'd like to come." The drive to Burnaby on Saturday was quiet in a way that had stopped being uncomfortable. Lily was waiting in the front window. Serena could see her silhouette from the street, bouncing slightly with the energy of someone who had been watching for the car for probably 45 minutes. She came down the path at a run, stopped 2 feet from Julian, and looked at him with the frank, unhurried assessment of a child who had not yet learned that this was considered impolite. "You're very tall," she said. "I am," Julian agreed. "My mom is tall too." Lily looked between them. "Are you her friend?" Julian crouched down to her level. Serena had not expected that. "I'm trying to be," he said. Lily considered this answer with appropriate seriousness. Then she held out her hand and Julian shook it. "Okay," she said, and turned around and led them both inside. He was good with her. Serena would not have predicted it, and she watched it with the slightly unsettled feeling of having her understanding of a person revised. He sat at the small table in her mother's living room and played 3 rounds of a card game whose rules Lily improvised as they went, and he played all 3 rounds with complete seriousness, protesting decisions he disagreed with in exactly the right register, present enough to be real competition, calibrated enough to let her win in a way that felt earned. Lily noticed. Lily noticed everything. On the drive back, Lily's drawing was still in Serena's bag. She didn't mention it, but she thought about the sun in the corner of the page, The gap Lily had said was nobody yet, and she didn't know what to do with the feeling that thought produced. "She's extraordinary," Julian said when they were back on the highway. "Yes," Serena said. "Does she know?" "No," Serena said quietly. "She knows I'm working on something important. She doesn't know the rest." Julian said nothing for a while. Then, "What will you tell her, afterward?" It was the first time either of them had directly named the afterward, the end of the arrangement, the returning to separate lives, each presumably changed, both presumably pretending not to be. Serena looked out the window at the bridge overhead. "I haven't decided." That night, alone in her room, she sat with that honestly for longer than was comfortable. She had been very careful since the beginning to keep the terms of her situation clear in her own mind. A business arrangement. A means to an end that mattered. Julian Mercer was not her family. The child she was carrying was not hers to keep. The house on the ridge was a temporary arrangement, and the warmth she sometimes felt in it was an occupational hazard she needed to manage. She was managing it less well than she would have liked. In the 31st week, Julian revised the contract. He called her into his office, a room she'd only been in twice, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that faced the window, and handed her a document that his lawyers had prepared. "I've made some changes," he said. "You should read them." She read them. The clause requiring her to relinquish all contact after the birth had been replaced with language establishing her right to ongoing involvement, visits, communication, a defined role in the child's life. The non-disclosure agreement had been amended to allow her to speak freely with her family. The compensation structure had been revised to remove the conditions attached to the final payment. She looked up. "Julian, I should have done this differently from the beginning," he said. He was standing at the window with his back to her, which she'd noticed he did when he was saying things he found difficult. "The arrangement I proposed it was how I handle things I'm afraid of. Controlling the parameters. But you're not a parameter." He paused. He didn't finish the sentence, but he turned around and she could see that he was working up to something that was costing him, and she waited. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because of the contract. Because I've spent 31 weeks beginning to understand who you are, and I don't." He stopped again. "I don't want to manage you out of my life when it becomes convenient. I want you to stay." Serena held the contract. The paper was expensive and slightly textured under her fingers. "Julian," she said carefully, "I need you to understand that I am not going to agree to anything because you've revised the terms. I would need to want this independently of any document." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to agree to anything tonight. I'm telling you that I don't want you to leave. What you do with that is your decision." She looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light came through the window behind him and made the room look warmer than it usually did. "I'm going to call my mother," she said, "and then I'm going to sleep on this. And I'm going to tell you one thing before I do." "All right. You are a genuinely difficult person," she said, "and you have made a lot of decisions in your life by treating uncertainty as something to be engineered around. And I think that's made you very successful and also quite lonely. And I think you know that." She folded the contract once, precisely. "But you're also the person who stayed in a hospital waiting room for 2 days without being asked, and who played 3 rounds of an improvised card game with a 5-year-old without once checking his phone. And I think you know that too." Julian was quiet. Something in him had stilled entirely. "Good night," Serena said, and left. She didn't sleep, of course. She lay in the room with the window cracked and listened to the trees and thought about Lily's drawing, the family holding hands, the sun in the corner. Nobody yet. She called her mother at 9, which was late, and her mother answered on the second ring because she always answered on the second ring. "You're going to ask me something," her mother said, skipping the preamble the way she did. "I might be doing something unwise," Serena said. "You've never done anything unwise in your life," her mother said. "That's been your whole problem." The baby arrived 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in November, with the particular impatient urgency of someone who has decided that a schedule exists only as a suggestion. Julian had driven her to the hospital himself. He held her hand during the labor with the focused, slightly desperate intensity of a man who had realized, somewhere in the intervening 6 weeks since their conversation in his office, that there was nothing in the world he could control about this, and who was genuinely trying to be all right with that. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms, a girl, 7 pounds even, with a scrunched and ferociously alive face. Julian Mercer, who Serena had watched remain composed through quarterly earnings crises and 2-day hospital vigils and 3 rounds of Lily's invented card game, sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed and cried with the quiet, unashamed thoroughness of someone releasing something that had been held for a very long time. "She's here," he said finally. His voice was different. Something in it had come loose. "She is," Serena said. She was exhausted in every direction. "What are you going to call her?" He looked up. "I thought." He paused. "I thought you might want a say in that." Serena looked at the baby, at her daughter who was and wasn't hers in all the ways that mattered most, and felt the particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself but arrives completely the way morning does. "June," she said. "She looks like June." Julian looked at the baby. "June," he repeated. He said it the way you say something you intend to keep. 2 months after June came home, on a cold, clear Sunday in January, Julian drove to Burnaby with Serena, and they brought Lily back with them. Lily sat in the back seat with Serena and asked 17 questions about the baby, and 4 questions about the house, and 1 question about whether Julian owned any pets. And when Julian said he didn't, she said, "You should get a dog," with the authority of someone issuing a directive rather than making a suggestion. "I'll consider it," Julian said very seriously. "Good," said Lily. The house on the ridge had been changed. Serena noticed it, or maybe she had made it change, gradually through the months of small negotiations between her presence and its spaces. Lily's drawings went up on the refrigerator. June's things accumulated on every flat surface with the cheerful entropy of a baby's belongings. Dorothy, who had been the most composed person Serena had ever met, could occasionally be heard in the kitchen making sounds at June that no composed person would make in public. On a Tuesday evening in March, Julian came home to find Serena at the kitchen table, helping Lily with her printing, June asleep in the carrier on Serena's chest, and Dorothy pretending to sort mail while actually listening to Lily explain why the letter Q was unfair. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Serena looked up and found him watching her with an expression she recognized now, the one that arrived and used to leave quickly, but had started, in recent weeks, to stay. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. He came into the kitchen, dropped his bag, and sat down at the table across from Lily. "You're late," Lily told him. "I am," he agreed. "I'm sorry. Did you save me any dinner?" "Dorothy did," Lily said. "I helped. Then I'm sure it's excellent." He looked at Serena. Something passed between them. Not a conversation, exactly, but something that functioned the same way. She'd been noticing those for months now. That evening, after Lily was asleep and June was asleep, and Dorothy had gone home, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet of a place that has people in it, Julian found Serena on the back deck with her tea, looking at the water. He came and stood beside her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes. Not the arrangement with Lily, not your place here, not—" "Julian," she said. "Yes? Ask the question." He was quiet for a moment. The inlet was dark and the lights on the far shore were small and steady. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not on any terms. Just stay." Serena looked at the water for a long time. She thought about the contract she'd signed at the hotel, the one that had felt like the closing of a door. She thought about the one he'd revised, which had felt like something different. A door opened, cautiously, from the inside. She thought about Lily asking Julian about pets, with the tone of someone who had already decided to include him in her life, and was simply informing him of the fact. She thought about June's face on the first morning, the particular fierce aliveness of it. She thought about her mother saying, "You've never done anything unwise in your life. That's been your whole problem." "Yes," she said. Julian exhaled, slow and steady, like someone who had been holding something for a very long time. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood together on the deck in the January cold, looking at the water and the lights and all the quiet, ordinary details of a life that neither of them had planned and both of them had somehow, through all the wrong reasons and the right ones, built together anyway.